So I'm gonna try using the dot cam just so I don't lose as much time kind of walking around between the board and here. I want to try to get through as much review as we possibly can. So I think that'll kind of help ensure that. The exam, kind of just the logistics of it, has 25 multiple choice questions and then 5 just true false at the end. So I kind of made the true false to be, I think, a little bit easier. So if you're kind of working through it, those last 5 shouldn't take you as much time as kind of the multiple choice questions should. But it'll be like a little bit different than kind of what the last exam. We didn't have any true and false questions there at the end. Kind of put them on there, actually thinking about hopefully they will help kind of boost grades is kind of what I'm thinking. Okay. I will use these screens to kind of display a couple formulas to you. So I think the one, really the main one is that you'll kind of see is, and actually, I'm going to stop this real quick. There we go. Should just be this one. So any kind of calculations that you should need, kind of or any formulas, this really should be the only form that you need. But I'll kind of remind you of that on the exam. It'll be like either I'll write it on the board or have it on the screens, whichever is probably easiest for you to see. Maybe actually putting it on the board, I can make it real big. Other than that, if I'm studying for it, I would go through those sets of practice problems, make sure you kind of understand the answer keys, and then also kind of going back through and reviewing, especially the last homework, but also the last 2 homeworks would be other problems that you kind of work through to make sure you know how to do those. In addition to that, going back through the completed versions of the slides, looking at any slide that kind of has iClicker on it, even if we didn't use it for iClicker points, making sure those slides have those headings so you can identify some other additional good review problems to make sure you know how those were solved. Okay. Oh, I think I'll go in and change it today so you can go back because the due date was last night, right? So I'll make sure that it's I have the due date set, and then I'll basically can store all the scores and then change it so that you can get back into it and kind of look at those. Yep. Any other questions about like the logistics of the exam, or doing it in class here? Now, one thing I'm also going to ask you to do, just to help me out, when you come to sit here on Wednesday, try to leave one desk in between you and the next person. Okay, so we're going to try to have one desk in between every single person. I don't think you guys were going to cheat, but it just helps me out being able to kind of see and kind of work around it. Also, if anyone has a question, I'm not like bumping into someone, just having some space in between each one. Okay. Any other logistics questions going into this exam? Okay. So, and if I'm writing anything, I can kind of see out of the corner of my eye what's on the screen here. But if it's ever not looking, like if I'm writing off of the screen or something, please let me know. I'll probably try to pick and choose and work through some of these unless people have specific questions, if they've already taken a look at some of these practice problem questions. Nobody has any specific questions they'd want to see worked through? Yeah. Yeah. All right. So that would be probably have one on here. Yeah. So let's kind of make sure we know how to do these. So there's 2 different types of ratios that we can kind of come up with, or ratios, some measure of basically market concentration. So here we've got some sales values. I might even make it easier, wink, wink on the exam. And instead of giving you sales, I might give you the market share to begin with, but just to kind of be complete so we understand really what we're doing here. We've got 5 different firms here, and they each have their associated sales numbers. Okay. So what I could do is come up with what % of the market each one of these firms owns, right? So let's see if we can get, why isn't it letting me grab the corner of this to make it bigger? There, oh, I had it for a second. There we go. Sorry about that. I don't know why it's okay. So what we're going to do So this is what, number 14? We're basically going to turn each one of these into a market kind of percent of the market share they own. So to do that, we have to get the total market share. So I take 200,000 plus a million, right? I'm just going to add up all those values, right? Add these 5 values up. I believe the total looks like what? 3, 4, it's going to be 5 million, okay? So if I get this total, it's going to be 5 million. So to turn each one of these into a market share percent, right, I would take their sales and divide it by the total. That's the proportion of sales from that firm. And then to get it to percentage, I would then multiply it by 100. That kind of converts my proportion into a percentage. Right? So if I look at this first one, 200,000 divided by 5 million here, this is going to be what? So 5 times, this would be 2.5%. I'm going to convert these all real quick for us. Now, like I said, I wouldn't ask you, I'm probably not going to do a sales one on the exam. It'd be more likely, and I'll zoom on this in a second. Oh, hold on. Let me change this to Zoom real quick. There you go. Right. So I'm going to cheat and use some Excel here, but if I added those up, I got that 5 million. Right. And then divide each one of these by 5, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to divide each one by 5 million. Change the format here so it looks like numbers instead of dollar signs. So we want numbers. Okay. So if I just divide each value by that total, it would give me a kind of proportion of the market share. I said, I'm going to multiply them by 100 to make them percentages. So here, this is going to be something more like what I would give you on the exam, probably using Excel to do it, right? So you'd have 5 different industries, whatever the names of them were, and you're going to have their market shares right next to them, okay? So if I asked you for a 4-firm concentration ratio, right, that would be simply taking the top 4 firms and adding up their market share, okay? So here, right, my 4-firm concentration ratio, what's kind of nice because they're actually almost ordered, I would take these top 4, right, and simply, actually, I'll blow this up in just a second. So this one was what, 0.04 that we found. But I would take 20 plus 30 plus 36 plus 10. Those are the market shares of the top 4 firms. Right? Should give me a 4-firm concentration ratio of 96. Okay, so that was question 14, I think. Yeah, actually, they just asked you about 1 firm, right? I'm probably not going to make you, like I said, I'm not going to make you convert sales data into totals just to kind of simplify it on the exam. But I might ask you for something like this 4-firm concentration ratio. I might also ask you for this HHI, right? So that actually, I'll give you that formula as well to kind of remind you. The HHI is just take the market share from every firm, square it, and add them all up, right? So in the context of this example, if we go back, we have 4 of the firms here, but the 5th one I think was 4, right? So we had 4, 20, 30, 36, and 10. Okay. So these were my market share percents. All I'm going to go through and do is square each one of these and then add them all up. So I would do 4 squared plus 20 squared plus 30 squared plus 36 plus 10 squared. So what, 4 squared is going to be 16, 20 squared is 400, 30 squared is 900. I might need help with this one. I don't know if I can do that one in my head. So squared would be, anybody want to help me out with this one? I can do it in Excel real quick if nobody's feeling generous here today. So 1296 was a little bit harder for me to do in my head. And oops. So 1296. And that's just a matter of adding all these up. So with the concentration ratio, that 4-firm concentration ratio, you're only taking the top 4 firms. Right? With the HHI, you're going to take the market share for every firm, square it, and then add them all up. Okay. So if I do that here, let me get what? 2, 1. So I think this is the value. If I'm doing math in my head correct here. If anybody wants to check me with a calculator, I would greatly appreciate it. Yeah. So when it comes to, don't worry about what I did in Excel here. Basically, to turn something into a market share, I would take the total sales from that firm and divide it by the total sales in the industry, and then multiply it by 100 to turn it into a percent. On the exam, I'll probably display it to you. I'll just give you the market shares. So they'll already be in percentages. Right? Oh, so it was probably something like this, right? Here was the total sales. So this is like, here was the total sales in the industry. Right? And here was like, you know, firm, I don't remember all the names, but so to turn kind of to determine how much, what market share each firm had, well, if I have 200,000 out of the 5 million, 200,000 divided by 5 million. So I'm guessing that problem, without looking at it specifically, I'm guessing that 200 was like total sales or something like that you were dividing by to convert that into what market share they had, right? But like I said, don't worry about that on the exam. If I give you an HHI or a concentration ratio example, I'll give you that percent market share. I'll have already done all that work, right? You're just going to have that percent market share and then use that. Oh, and I already need to be sharing the screen. So I was going to give you those market shares, and then you can either find that kind of 4-firm concentration ratio, or you can find that HHI, right? You could do either one. Okay. Any other questions kind of related to those?
So the 4-firm concentration is just based on the market share percentages. Has nothing to do with squaring. Right?
Nope. It's just adding up the top 4 firms' market share, right? Or percent market share, I should say. And the HHI is squaring. So basically the HHI, first of all, it allows you, we talked about, I think when we were in class when we were going over this, let's say I had a monopoly or a duopoly. What's going to be true about the concentration ratios of both? Yeah, right? Because the one I would have one firm has 100%, the other I have 2 firms have 50, but when I add them up, it's a concentration ratio still of 100%. So this is somewhat limited in that I can't identify or like make the distinction between heavily concentrated industries. I can't tell if it's a duopoly, a monopoly. I can't tell if one firm has 90% and then there's 10 other firms with 1%. I can't determine that. But the HHI, right, is going to be able to identify that. And also squaring the market share. I don't want to go into this too much because you don't have to necessarily understand the mechanics. Really, all you need to understand is that this HHI will be higher for heavier concentrated industries. But you know, if I have 1 and I square it, it's still 1, right? If I have 2 as the market share and I square it, it's 4. If I have 3 and I square it, it's 9. So notice higher market shares are really going to be penalized, right? When I square that value, it's going to add a huge number to my HHI, okay? And so the HHI is really kind of picking up and over penalizing highly concentrated industries, right? So, and it also allows you to identify differences between monopolies, duopolies. You can kind of prove it to yourself if plug in your calculator, 100 squared is 10,000. You then take, a duopoly where they both have the same amount, 50 squared plus 50 squared, that would just add up to 5,000. So it can really identify differences between kind of heavily concentrated industries a lot better than that 4-firm concentration ratio. Okay. Any other questions related to kind of those 2 measures? Okay. So So that was kind of looking at 14 and 15. We could think through 16, think through these measures a little bit differently. So which of these statements would not be true? Okay. So the four-firm concentration ratio in a perfectly competitive industry is lower than a monopoly. Well, these measures are both measures of market concentration, right? So a monopoly is literally one firm has 100% of the market share. Perfectly competitive, we don't know how many firms there will be, but we know there's going to be a lot, right? Many, many firms, right? It's a homogeneous product. We said we have to have many firms. And so we know it won't be as concentrated as the most concentrated thing, which is a monopoly market, right? So right away, saying that a perfectly competitive market has a four-firm concentration ratio lower than a monopoly, well, yeah, that makes sense, right? It should have a lower measure. It's less concentrated. So that one's true. We're looking for which one's not true. The HHI of a perfectly competitive industry is greater than that of monopoly. Well, once again, these measures are both, right, at their principle. Like if we don't worry about the numbers even, the higher both of them are, the more concentrated the industry is. So can a monopoly have a higher, or sorry, can a perfectly competitive industry have a greater HHI than a monopoly? No. Monopoly is the most concentrated market we can ever see. So right away, we know that B can't be true, right? And then the higher the four-firm concentration ratio, the less competitive an industry is. Well, that's true, right? The higher these measures get, the less and less competitive, right? The more and more, the closer and closer we're getting to a monopoly, right? So that one makes sense. And then we kind of said a monopoly would have an HHI of 10,000. Well, you should know that a monopoly has 100% of the market share. They're the only firm. So when you go to square the market shares, you only have one firm that has 100, right? So the HHI for a monopoly, you would just be taking 100 squared, which if you plug that into a calculator, sure enough, you get 10,000. So the only one that wasn't true there, right, we said was B, so that was kind of the correct answer. But really what this hinges on is knowing that, you know, these measures, as they get higher and higher, they're telling you there's a more and more concentrated, or sorry, a heavier concentrated industry, or that we have less competition, right? We're approaching a monopoly as these two kind of indexes or these measures get higher and higher, okay? Any other questions related to that? I don't think we spent quite as much time on those, but I think that's good. I want to go back to something that's older. Let's say, because I gave you something like this. Okay. So number one, diminishing returns, right, implies which of the following. So there's kind of there was some couple themes that we talked about. We started out this kind of block after that first exam. The first thing we thought about was what happens to labor, right? We said, as we hire more and more workers, what happens to their kind of overall productivity? Well, we're hiring the best worker first, then the next best worker, then the next. So over time, as we hire more and more workers or want to kind of produce higher and higher levels of output, we said that the returns from labor are what? Diminishing or decreasing. So this diminishing returns applies to that marginal product of our labor was decreasing. Okay. On the exam, I'd probably be a little bit more specific because of the terminology we use in class, and kind of have marginal productivity of labor is decreasing. Marginal productivity of labor is negative, right? But that diminishing returns, it was kind of referencing that as we hire more and more workers, there's diminishing returns to the product of labor. Okay. We then said that was related to costs, because as I wanted to produce a higher and higher level of output, that meant I have to hire more and more workers. So to get the same number of units, right, over time, as I kind of produce more and more, I'm going to have to hire more and more workers, but now I'm hiring less and less efficient workers. And because we had diminishing returns to labor, that implied that we were also going to have increasing marginal costs, right? So when we were looking at those cost curves, we said, as I want to produce higher and higher quantities of labor, right, my marginal cost curve was going to be increasing, right? Reflecting that, maybe for the first, going from 50 to 60 units, I only had to hire one worker. Their marginal product was 10 units, right? That one worker could make all 10 units themselves. But then over time, right? And so it was just the wage of one worker. But then, if I'm looking at higher quantities, maybe going from 190 to 200 units, well, at this point, I've exhausted all the very efficient workers. Now I'm down to workers who can only produce one unit on their own. And so now to get these 10 additional units, right? Same increase in the number of units. Maybe now here I need kind of number of workers I need would be 10 workers. And I got to pay them all whatever the equilibrium wage for this specific job is. And so my costs are much higher for these higher quantities. We also said there's a portion of the marginal cost curve. We said it kind of looks like a Nike swoosh, right? So this portion here, where as I was producing more, my marginal costs were actually falling. What did we say that was a byproduct though? Yeah, that was because initially, when we were hiring more and more workers, for the first few workers, right, and the first few units of product that we're making, that our workers are actually specializing. Yeah, we hired the best worker first and then the next best, so on. But as we hired the first couple, now one person doesn't have to do 5 different jobs, right? They can all kind of focus on one specific job and be, really efficient at that one thing. So initially we have specialization, which kind of causes the marginal product of labor to increase, which means that the marginal costs will initially be decreasing because of this specialization. Over time, specialization doesn't occur anymore. I mean, once I've filled out the kind of very specific tasks, now it just goes back to I'm hiring less and less productive workers. So my marginal product is diminishing, which results in this increasing marginal cost curve. Okay. I'm kind of mentioning just broad kind of scopes here, or broad kind of terms to think about this. But right, there could be some kind of question where if you see the marginal product of labor increasing initially for increases in quantity, this would be a result of, and we said kind of specialization, right? Initially, we're maybe able to get some gains there from specialization. All right, so let's think about a word problem here. And this is really going back to how do we determine averages and marginal costs, or average and marginal revenues, right? So we've got, I don't know, this paper company producing 10 units of output. The marginal cost of production is $18. The average variable cost of production is 20 for the 11th unit of output. And then we have different ranges for what? Average variable, average total, and then marginal costs. Okay. So if at a certain quantity, we have the marginal cost, we have the average variable cost, right? We said that, and here, anytime you've got a problem, like every problem on this exam, almost you should could draw out a picture, right? So one thing that we know to be true, I probably could use that last thing, is that my marginal cost is going to hit my average variable, and I didn't draw this one very well to scale. This should be the minimum point of average variable. I drew this poorly, I apologize. But right, the marginal cost should intersect average variable and should intersect average total costs at its minimum point, okay? So if I'm told that I'm currently at a quantity of 10 and the marginal cost was 18 and the average, oh, what was I forgot. Was the average total cost was, so the average variable cost is 20 and the marginal cost is 18. So I know that I'm at a quantity where the marginal cost is below my average variable, right? I was told that the marginal cost was 18 at this quantity of 10 and the average variable was 20. So what do I know is going to be true if I'm then looking at the 11th unit? Okay. Well, anytime my marginal cost is below my average variable, average total, we said the new average will be lower, right? I'm adding a smaller value to my old set of numbers. My new average is going to be going down, right? So notice here, when my marginal cost is below average variable, the average variable cost was decreasing. When marginal costs are below average total costs are decreasing. Okay. So I know that for that 11th unit, if average variable costs are decreasing, my new average variable cost should be somewhere below 20, right? I know I can say that. So if I look at these potential answers here, the average variable cost must be greater than 20. That doesn't make any sense based off what we just said. We did say that the new average variable cost for that 11th unit should be, right, it was decreasing, should be less than 20. So B here, we know is going to be the correct answer, but can we rule the rest of these out, right? Hopefully, otherwise there's two correct answers here. The marginal cost must be less than 18, right? Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You know, potentially if I gave you some information about that we've got specialization occurring, probably should have been a little bit more complete in this answer, but we usually assume that we're looking at the portion of the marginal cost curve where we're increasing, right? That's the relevant portion. So as I'm going to higher and higher units, my marginal cost should be going up. So if my marginal cost at the 10th unit was 18, marginal cost of the 11th unit should be a little bit higher, right? My marginal cost should be, so D didn't make any sense there. I think it then said the average total cost should be less than 20. Well, we have no idea what our fixed costs are here. So we have no idea what this gap in average variable and average total are. So at that 11th unit, I mean, average total, we could be way up here at, you know, I don't know, we could be at 200 if our fixed costs were large enough, right? We could have a huge gap in between our total and our variable costs if the fixed costs are really large. So we really can't say anything. We weren't given any information to be able to say anything about average total, right? Well, it's not completely true. What's maybe one thing I could definitely say about average total costs? They should be greater than my average variable, right? So I know they're probably somewhere above 20, right? But I think here it said in the it was like less than 20. Now that doesn't make any sense. How can our total costs? What's the only way our total cost could be less than variable costs? We'd have to have like negative fixed costs, which doesn't make any sense, right? Our fixed costs are like these amounts that we've spent on our building or something like that. So total costs should never be below variable costs, right? It should always be higher. So that doesn't make, C doesn't make any sense at all. Okay. And you know, one thing I would maybe do is kind of preparing for this exam, go back and look at some of these markets, go back and look at like our perfectly competitive market and this cost structure that we drew out. And you should be able to draw this every single time, like not with the numbers, but you should be able to draw this every time. You should always know marginal cost looks like this little Nike swoosh. It has this small period where it's decreasing and then increasing, right? You should then always be able to draw your average variable and average total cost curves because they're just U-shapes where the minimum point is where it intersects that marginal cost. And if you really want to so here's my marginal cost. If you really want to highlight it, maybe you draw like a really sharp U, right? So you really can think about, oh yeah, the minimum point here is my average variable and average total cost, right? So I can really see here, oh yeah, that's at that minimum point, okay? And then from there we can think, okay, marginal cost is below average variable, then the new average variable, it's going down or it's decreasing, and all these other things that we talked about, okay? Any questions on anything that I just said there? And that would be a tougher problem. I'll be honest. That would be one of the tougher problems that you would see on the exam. I don't think I actually probably put anything quite that hard, but it's still good to know how to solve that one, thinking about how to draw out your cost structures. Okay. So if I'm looking at this table in problem 3 instead, and I asked you, what's the marginal cost of the 40th bike? So it's a little bit difficult, right? So we're moving from 30, our quantity jumps here are in tens, right? So to get the 40th bike, I have to, for whatever reason in my production process, create batches of 10 bikes at a time, right? So I'm moving from 30 to 40. What would my marginal cost be? Okay. Well, before we even look at the numbers or look at the table, let's remember how we calculate anything that's marginal, right? So my marginal cost simply means what's the change in my total costs divided by the change in the number of units I produced, right? We then also had things like marginal revenue. Well, that was just the change in total revenue from the change in the number of units we produced. Okay. So anytime we're looking at the marginal blank, it's the change in whatever that blank is, right? Cost of revenues would be the change in total costs or the change in total revenues divided by the change in quantity, always divided by whatever that change in production or the change in output or the change in quantity was, right? 3 different ways of saying the same thing. So here we had 10 unit jump. So the change in quantity was 10, right? It went from 30 to 40. Okay. What would the change in my total cost be? Well, we have a little bit of work we would have to do here because all I have are the average total costs, okay? But if I'm producing 30 units and on average, each one costs me $40 to produce, what are my total costs there? If I'm producing 30 units and on average, each one costs me $40, just 30 times 40, right? Simplify this way. If I'm producing 10 units and each unit costs me $2, then my total cost there would be, well, 10 units at $2, $20, right? 2 times 10. So if you ever want to find kind of your total, but all you have is your average, well, if I've got 30 units and on average, it costs me $40 for each one, right? My total cost here would just be 30 times 40 or 1,200. So you'll kind of see here, it might be nice to have a calculator with you. Make sure you're bringing a working calculator with you to the exam. Now, it shouldn't be anything crazy, right? Just multiplication, some addition, right? And then the next one, I believe, so this was the total cost of 30 units. And I think at 40 units, right, my average total cost, so this was just, we're taking the quantity, multiplying it by how much it costs on average to produce each one of those units. Right? I think the average total cost we were given for 40 units was 45, right? So this is what, 1,600 plus 200, if I'm doing math in my head correctly, or 1,800. Okay. So what was my change in total cost going from 30 to 40 units? Yeah, just 600. So 600 was my change in total costs. So what? My marginal cost would be 60. Okay. Does that make sense how we went about that? So we weren't given directly the total cost, but if you know how much on average it costs you to produce something, then you just take how much you're producing and you multiply it by that average. Right? If it costs me on average $2 to make something and I'm producing 100 of them, well, my total costs are $200, right? 2 times 100. So there we're just grabbing those values for quantity and our kind of average costs or average total costs from this table. Once I had the total costs, then I said, okay, it's just the change in total costs divided by the change in quantity there, which here we had 10 unit jumps. Okay, so I think C is the correct answer there. Any questions on that? Or why we did something to the work? Yeah, sorry. Oops. And this was just not related to the problem. I was just kind of making a broader point about how we calculate things on the margin. Right? Questions on this one? All right, I will leave this up here on the side. So the next one, it says, what are the fixed costs of production? Okay. So here, this one is a little bit tricky. I'd probably do something a little bit different on the exam, right? I probably would give you kind of what your production level was, a quantity of 0. I would tell you what your costs were there. So let's say, for example, I gave you the quantity of 0, and you know that total costs at a quantity of 0 are $500. What will your fixed cost be? I think someone just said it. $500, right? Because your fixed costs are the costs that you have to incur, even if you're producing nothing. So if I give you like this additional row where you had quantity, and then I told you, your total costs were $500, well, then your fixed costs have to be whatever your total is there, because you're not producing anything. Your variable costs variable costs, if you're producing nothing, should just be zero. Right? Because variable costs were things that, were related to how much I'm producing. Right? So if I'm producing zero, my variable costs have to be zero. And if that makes all of my total costs just represents my fixed costs. Okay. Now, on this one, it's a little bit more difficult, right? Because I don't have that quantity level of zero. Right? So this is maybe something good to know for the exam, looking at that quantity of zero, something I might give you instead. Right? But even if I didn't, if I'm looking here, if I know that my average fixed costs at a quantity of 20 or 10, right? So when I'm producing 20 units, my average fixed cost per unit would be $10. Okay. So if we go to thinking about averages, grab every single piece of paper I have here. When we're thinking about averages, that's simply taking a total and dividing it by the quantity. So my average fixed cost is just take my total fixed cost and divide it by how many units I'm producing. If I'm producing 100 units, right, then that fixed cost gets kind of shared across more units if I'm only producing 10. Okay. Anytime we want a quantity, if I want an average, if I want an average total cost, that's just total cost over quantity. If I want an average variable cost, that's just variable costs over quantity. Okay. So here I was told I had on the chart, I believe I had a quantity of 10 and average fixed cost. No, sorry, I said that backwards. A quantity of 20 and an average fixed cost of 10. Okay. What I was asked for was, what's my total fixed cost? Well, here I've got one equation. One thing I don't know, it just rearranges the equation a little bit. So if I plug those values in, it's going to look like this. This is where you have to use a little bit of algebra, multiply both sides by 20, and I get my total fixed costs are what? 20 times 10 or 200.
Okay. Average fixed cost even a reasonable standard to measure anyway? Aren't your fixed costs just regular?
So think about it this way. I've got this huge lump sum payment for my fixed costs. If I can produce 1,000 instead of 100 units, I'm spreading that across more units. Right? To say, once
you know that sum, is it really worth it?
Is it really worth dealing with average fixed cost? Usually not. Right? The only real benefit of knowing our average fixed cost is being able to identify the kind of going from average total to average variable. We don't really notice after, I use it, I kind of show you to think about this idea of calculating average cost because it makes sense about the numbers never changing. So I'm just spreading it across more units. It's always going to be kind of declining. These are a little bit trickier, right? Because my marginal costs are increasing. And so my variable costs are never going to be just the same value. They're always changing with the quantity. So that's why we start out with this, kind of you got to walk before you can run kind of thing. But notice, once we got to average variable and average total, we never really used average fixed again, right? When we're thinking about shutdown decisions, we always compare it to average variable cost. When we think about profits, we're comparing to average total. We don't really, average fixed cost doesn't inform any of our decision making. Any questions on kind of just how to solve this one though? It shouldn't be too bad. I'm thinking through these. Okay. So here's a question, right? Given this table, which of the following can I say? So if I'm looking at these values, can I say this firm is in the short or the long run? What's true about the long run? We said profits are zero, but also no fixed costs. So if I'm looking at a table and there's any positive value for fixed costs, I automatically know I'm dealing with something that's in the short run, right? So right away here, we can say that it's in the short run. Right? We don't really have any production decisions. We weren't told that, the firm chooses this level of quantity or anything like that. So just from the cost structure, there's no way we can identify the difference between a monopolist or a perfectly competitive market. So for instance, anytime I'm drawing out whether or not it's a monopoly or a perfectly competitive firm, they're all facing the same cost structure. They all have increasing marginal costs. They all face these U-shaped average total and average variable costs. The only differences when we look across markets are their marginal revenue curves, right? So this isn't a specific question, but probably something kind of good to review. I can actually do it here since I've got this drawn out. So a monopolist in a perfectly competitive market would face the same cost structures. It's just that for a monopolist, right, they face the entirety of demand and make a price decision based off of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. And I kind of walked you through the algebra of why this is twice as steep if I'm only setting a single price. But you don't have to know that algebra. All you have to know is for a monopolist or a monopolistic competitive firm, they kind of face this demand curve and a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. They also kind of face this, or sorry, for a perfectly competitive market, we know that they face a marginal revenue curve that is simply horizontal at whatever that equilibrium price is, right? So the differences across these different markets are not their cost structures, right? They have the same average total, same marginal cost. The differences are the marginal revenue curves they face. Okay? So when you're drawing these out for a perfectly competitive market, you've got this horizontal marginal revenue curve. For a monopolist, right, we can think about you're going to be facing the entirety of demand and a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. And what did we say last couple of classes? And I'm going through some older stuff today because the last few classes at the end of each one last week, I went through some more like kind of newer stuff, like market structure stuff. And we said that no matter what market we're in, every firm chooses the optimal quantity by doing what? Setting quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue every single time. Okay. Now, sometimes for a perfectly competitive firm, that happens to be the equilibrium price as well. Right. For the monopolist, that's not true, right? Usually that price, they kind of show, oh, sorry, I got my curves mixed up here, but they would choose where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue and then go up and set the price at the demand curve, right? So for a monopolist or these monopolistic competitive markets, we always said, right, their price is going to be above marginal cost or above marginal revenue, or, but I was kind of pointing out that the difference is really there. The cost structures are the same, okay? All right. It's another one I want to go through here. Kind of did one of these at the end of last class. I want to go through something that's a little bit related to monopolies, if I can find it. Okay. So one thing I want to go through is the differences between single price and perfectly price discriminating monopolists. Okay. So we said, maybe I've got kind of my quantity demand curve here and then the associated prices. If this is all I had, how can I determine the marginal revenue for the third unit? Now, I could have given you equations here, and we would know that marginal revenue for a single price monopolist, I just said, should be what? Twice as steep. Okay. So these price quantity combinations, if I really wanted to, I could like meticulously plot out each one of them on a graph, right? So I could go, what? At a price of $10, quantity was 0. At a price of 8, quantity was 1. I could then kind of go through, do that, and I'd have my entire demand curve graphed out. Right? Well, now I know that marginal revenue should be twice as steep. Right? So notice here, for every unit increase, right, going from 0 to 1, the price fell by 2. So for marginal revenue, if it's twice as steep, when I do that same unit increase from 0 to 1, how much is the price going to fall? Or kind of the dollar amount going to fall here? If it's twice as steep, should fall by 4 or be 6, right? So I could go through at each one of these quantities and think, whatever that decrease in price was, the decrease in my marginal revenue will be twice as much, right? So I'm going to add a little column here, but if you were doing this like on the exam, you could write it right next to it. Actually here, which makes more sense. I'll do it to the right here. So if I'm thinking about finding my marginal revenue here, oops. For the first one, right, if I'm selling 0 units, my revenue is 0. It doesn't actually, we usually don't put a 0 in there. We say like, there's no marginal revenue for that 0 quantity. But for the very first unit, if price fell by 2, then my marginal revenue, instead of being falling by 2 would fall by 4, and we said it would be 6. Going down to that second unit, instead of falling by 2, it would fall by 4. So this would just be what? 2. Going down one more unit, instead of 2, it falls by 4. So this becomes -2. Going up one more unit, it falls another 4. So -6. And then down here, -10. So if it were me on the exam, kind of right next to this, I would kind of write in my marginal revenues as a separate column. Now, when I'm asked for something like what's the marginal unit, the marginal revenue, sorry, of the third unit sold, -2. Okay. And that came from the knowledge that marginal revenue is twice as steep, right? Okay. So price and quantity here are really just telling you the points that you'd be at on your demand curve. Okay. You know, the points on your marginal revenue curve will be those same quantities, but instead of kind of price falling at a slope of 2, marginal revenue would have a slope twice as steep as that, so price would be falling by kind of 4. And I say price here, it's probably better to think about our y-axis is really kind of the dollar amounts, because like the different points on marginal revenue don't represent price, they really represent dollars. But when we're talking about demand, they represent price, but it's all because it's in the same units of like, what's the value in dollars, right? Any questions on that? We'll keep moving here. Okay. So one thing that we said, and this is kind of a good thing to review, is that whenever marginal revenue is positive, we said that demand was elastic, right? Or we started up here on this elastic portion of the demand curve. The point where marginal revenue is 0, this is where we kind of said like total revenues would be maximized, not profits, but total revenues would be maximized. This is going back to some older stuff. And we said it was unit elastic. We then said anytime marginal revenue, notice here, it would be below this like 0 point. So marginal revenues here are negative. That represented inelastic portions of my demand curve. Okay. So you kind of think about here, maybe it's another way of writing that on here. So one thing that we said was monopolists, as long as marginal costs are positive and increasing, we're always going to intersect, like even if it was like marginal cost started here, we're still going to choose an optimal quantity that's on the elastic portion, right? But anytime we see negative marginal revenues, so if we're looking at that quantity of 3 and we've got a negative marginal revenue there, well, then we know we're on the inelastic portion of our demand curve. In practice, we would never see that occur because we know the monopolist will always choose a quantity on the elastic portion, because that will always be, if we're looking at the, we could do the mathematical proof, but for the sake of what kind of our class, just have that and not like you just know, memorize that or kind of know that that's always going to be the case. You don't have to be able to mathematically prove it. The monopolist will always choose kind of a quantity where we're somewhere on the elastic portion of the demand curve. But if for some reason we saw someone choose kind of these quantities where the marginal revenue is negative, that would be on the inelastic portion of the demand curve. Okay. So here, I could say the quantities 3, 4, and 5, demand is inelastic. For the quantities of 1 and 2, demand is elastic, right? Because we have positive marginal revenues here. Any questions on that one? Try to wrap this up here. One more question. If we've got the monopolist, what would the marginal revenue be for the third unit sold if they're perfectly price discriminating? So if we had a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, we said that they're going to charge a price for every unit that's exactly on the demand curve, right? Because they don't have to charge one price anymore. They can charge several prices. So at that third unit, they're just going to, actually, I think the third unit was over here, sorry. They're going to charge whatever price they're at on that demand curve. So their marginal revenue curve for a perfectly price discriminating monopolist just becomes the demand curve. So for that third unit, the price that they would charge would just be that $4, right? So this perfectly price discriminating monopolist kind of increases their marginal revenue curve to basically just be whatever the existing demand curve was. Because at every quantity, they can change the price that they're charging for that. Now, on the exam here, I probably wouldn't ask for the same unit every single time, just in case you made a previous error. It wouldn't kind of affect you on the following one. I'll get this kind of posted. If I have some time this afternoon, I might kind of make some short videos, or maybe tomorrow morning, make some short videos of me working through some more problems, and you might see those getting put up on the YouTube page. I can't promise that. I've got some things that'll keep me busy tomorrow, but I think I can find some time to kind of get some videos made. Other than that, I'll be in my office today from 3 to 4. If you have any kind of questions over any of these problems, or tomorrow, I'm pretty free most of the day in terms of I can move things around. So if 11 to 1 doesn't work for you, send me an email. We can set up a time to kind of go over any problems or questions that you have. Okay. Other than that, I will see you guys on Wednesday.